At an airport, two white airline staff stopped a black soldier. The soldier had all the papers for himself and his comrade's body to board the plane, but the two did not believe and wanted to make things difficult for him. What will happen? Are the two policemen doing the right thing? Follow the story with me. This is H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Darius King was a man defined by his duty. At 32 years old, he had already seen more of the world than most people could ever imagine. An African-American man, Darius had spent the better part of his adult life serving his country, first in the military, and then in his role as a veteran, helping others adjust to civilian life. His past was filled with memories, some painful, others proud, but through it all, one thing remained constant: his commitment to service. This particular mission, however, felt different. It wasn't the kind of mission he was used to, one involving high-intensity operations or tactical maneuvers. This mission was personal. He wasn't just traveling across the country for a meeting or a briefing. Darius was on a solemn journey, a mission that involved far more than just physical movement. It was a journey of respect, honor, and duty. On this day, Darius was standing in line at Los Angeles International Airport, carefully watching the clock as he waited to board his flight. In his hands, he held all the necessary paperwork for his journey. The documents were stamped, signed, and approved by the relevant authorities, ensuring that everything was in order for him to transport the body of his fallen comrade, Private William "Billy" Walker. Billy had been killed in action just weeks earlier, a casualty of the violent conflict that seemed to escalate with no end in sight. Billy had been a good man, someone Darius had trained with, fought alongside, and considered a friend. They had been deployed together on various missions, facing danger in far-off lands, but it was in their final assignment that Billy made the ultimate sacrifice. When the news came that Billy had fallen, Darius had been devastated. He had seen death before, too much of it, but it was different when it came to someone you knew, someone who had shared the hardships of war with you. After the funeral, Darius made a promise to Billy's family that he would personally bring Billy home to his final resting place in their hometown of Detroit. The body was being transported in a special casket, sealed and securely stored. Darius had gone to great lengths to ensure that everything was prepared correctly. He had worked with military logistics, the funeral home, and the airlines, securing the necessary permissions to carry out the transportation of the fallen soldier's remains. Darius' eyes scanned the crowd of passengers milling around the terminal, waiting for their flights. There was a certain coldness to the atmosphere, a rushed, mechanical energy that permeated the place. People hustled to and fro, each person focused on their own individual mission. Some were headed to vacations, others for business trips, but Darius knew that his mission was unlike any other. He glanced down at the small duffel bag slung over his shoulder, the weight of the duty inside weighing on him. Inside, he had the paperwork that confirmed the legitimacy of his mission: military transportation documents, letters from his commanding officers, and a certificate of authenticity for the body. All of it had been checked and rechecked by authorities at every step of the way, making sure everything was in perfect order. A group of flight attendants passed by, laughing and chatting, their bright uniforms standing out in the bustling crowd. Darius took a deep breath. The flight would be a long one, about 5 hours, and that was just the beginning of his journey. Once he arrived in Detroit, there would be another set of arrangements to be made. But for now, all he had to do was board the plane, ensure the safe transport of Billy's body, and return him home with the respect he deserved. The boarding process started, and Darius fell in line with the other passengers. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, more so than he had anticipated. He had already served in combat, faced challenges in dangerous corners of the world, and endured the loss of comrades, but this mission was different. This was about more than just the fallen soldier. It was about honoring a life lost, ensuring that Billy's family could lay him to rest in peace, and showing the respect that every soldier deserved. He approached the gate, and the airline staff greeted him with the usual professionalism. They checked his ticket and identification without hesitation. Then came the question that would change everything. "Sir," the gate agent said, looking at Darius with a stern expression, "we need to speak with you for a moment." Darius paused. Something was off. He followed the agent toward a nearby desk, wondering if there had been an issue with his paperwork. He had made sure everything was in order, but the agent's tone made him uneasy. The agent's expression was unreadable as she handed him a clipboard. "Is there a problem?" Darius asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The agent seemed reluctant, almost as though she wasn't sure how to explain. Finally, she spoke, her words cutting through the air. "We've received an alert from the security department," she said, her eyes scanning the clipboard as if checking some invisible list. "It's about the body you're transporting. We can't allow you to bring it on the flight." Darius' heart skipped a beat. His stomach sank. He had been through the appropriate channels, made all the proper arrangements. There had to be some mistake. "I'm sorry, what?" he said, his voice low and controlled. "I've done everything right. I have the documentation, everything. This is the body of a fallen soldier. I have permission to transport it." The agent looked uncomfortable, but her eyes remained cold. "I understand, sir," she replied, her voice matter of fact, "but we can't allow you to bring the body on board just yet. We need to inspect it first. You'll have to step aside for additional security checks." Darius' mind raced. The shock of the situation left him momentarily speechless. He had dealt with delays before, even with security checks on high-risk flights, but this felt different. The agent's words rang in his ears. "Inspect it first." He glanced down at the casket, his thoughts clouded with confusion and anger. This was no ordinary package. It was a body, a human life, the remains of a soldier who had given everything. How could they treat this with such indifference? The stark realization hit him that something far more insidious was at play. "Why is this happening?" Darius asked, trying to keep his composure. His voice was firm but tinged with disbelief. "This is a military transport. Why are you treating me like a criminal?" The agent didn't answer directly. She only nodded toward a supervisor who had emerged from behind the desk. Darius' stomach twisted as the new figure walked over, his eyes scanning Darius, clearly sizing him up. "This is an unusual situation," the supervisor said, his voice cold. "We need to follow protocol. I'm afraid you'll have to comply with the additional security measures. We can't make exceptions." Darius felt a surge of frustration, but he knew he had to keep his calm. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Billy, for the soldier who had given his life for this country. He had promised Billy's family that he would return him home with honor, and nothing was going to stop him. "I'll cooperate," Darius said, his voice unwavering, "but I'm not leaving this airport without him." The supervisor gave him a terse nod, signaling for him to follow. As they walked toward the security checkpoint, Darius' mind churned. The flight was supposed to be a simple task, a final journey for a fallen comrade. Now, it seemed like a battle he hadn't expected, a battle for the respect and dignity of a soldier who had already paid the ultimate price. The atmosphere at the gate was tense as Darius King approached the check-in counter. He held his head high, his back straight, his military training kicking in, urging him to remain composed. The day had already been full of emotional weight, and this was supposed to be the last hurdle, the simple process of boarding the flight that would take him and the body of his fallen comrade, Private Billy Walker, back home. But as he neared the counter, Darius sensed that something was off. The airline staff greeted him with their usual professionalism, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. A young woman at the counter looked at him with a polite but distant expression. Her uniform was neat, her posture straight, but something in her demeanor made Darius uneasy. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your documents?" she asked, her voice clipped and formal. Darius nodded, reaching into his bag and retrieving the carefully prepared documents. The folder contained everything: the military transport papers, the letters of authorization, and the certificate confirming the body's transportation status. All the necessary paperwork had been verified weeks ago, with every detail meticulously checked and double-checked. There was no reason why there should be any issue. This was a straightforward mission, and he had followed the rules to the letter. He handed the documents over, watching as the young woman flipped through the papers. Her fingers moved quickly, scanning each page, her brow furrowing as she paused on one section. Darius held his breath, trying to remain calm as she continued to skim through the folder. "Everything seems to be in order," the woman said after a brief moment, her tone almost surprised, as if she hadn't expected to find anything wrong. "But we've just been informed that there's a problem with the transport of the body. I'm afraid you won't be able to board with it." Darius blinked in disbelief, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "I have the proper documentation. This is a military transport. The body of a fallen soldier is being returned to his family. There's no issue here." The young woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the terminal as if searching for confirmation from someone else. She then looked back at Darius, and her expression shifted to one of barely contained unease. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm afraid there's an issue with the flight. We've been instructed not to allow the body on board." Her voice was soft but authoritative, as though she had been trained to deliver such news without allowing any room for negotiation. Darius' mind raced. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. The body of a fallen soldier, who had made the ultimate sacrifice for this country, was being treated like a piece of cargo, as if it didn't deserve the same respect that any other passenger might receive. He had followed every protocol to the letter. His paperwork had been approved, his permissions were in place, and yet here he stood, being told that he couldn't board the flight with Billy's body. "No," Darius said, shaking his head, his voice now tinged with frustration. "This doesn't make sense. I've been through security checks. I've spoken with military officials. There's no reason to stop me now. I need to bring him home." The young woman stepped back slightly, visibly uncomfortable, and Darius could see her trying to make eye contact with a supervisor. Her hands nervously fidgeted with the edge of the counter, and she glanced down at the paperwork again, as though hoping that somehow things would resolve themselves. "I'm sorry, sir," she repeated, though her apology felt hollow. "I'm afraid I'm not authorized to approve the transport of the body at this time. I'm going to have to ask you to follow our security team for further verification." "Verification," Darius repeated, his frustration growing with each passing second. "What kind of verification? My documents are legitimate. This is a military transport. The body belongs to a soldier who gave his life for this country." Despite Darius' calm demeanor, a storm was brewing inside him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was a veteran, a man who had served his country, now being treated like a criminal simply for wanting to transport a fallen comrade back to his family. The thought of it infuriated him, but he knew he couldn't allow his anger to get the better of him. Not yet, not when everything was still hanging in the balance. The young woman, realizing that the situation was escalating, motioned toward a pair of security officers who were standing nearby. The officers were tall, imposing figures in dark uniforms, and they approached the counter with purposeful steps. Their presence made Darius' stomach tighten. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice flat and emotionless. Darius looked from the officers to the young woman behind the counter, who was still trying to avoid eye contact. He felt his pulse quicken, and for the briefest moment he considered arguing, demanding to speak with a higher authority. But then he remembered what was at stake. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't about his pride or his rights. This was about Billy, about giving him the honor he deserved in life and death. He couldn't allow bureaucracy, ignorance, or prejudice to stand in his way. "Fine," Darius said, his voice low but firm, signaling his compliance. "I'll cooperate, but I want a clear explanation of why this is happening. I want to know what's going on." The security officers didn't answer him as they began to guide him away from the counter, leading him toward a small office off to the side. Darius could feel the stares of the other passengers on him, their curious eyes following his every move. He tried not to pay attention to them, but the way some of them looked at him, particularly the older passengers, made his blood run cold. They didn't know what was happening, but it was clear that they could sense something was wrong. As he walked toward the security office, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was something more sinister going on here, something that was rooted in a much deeper issue. Why was he being singled out? Why was the transport of this body being questioned when everything was in order? The door to the office closed behind him with a soft click, and he was led to a seat in the center of the room. The two officers stood by the door, keeping a close watch on him, their eyes hard and unblinking. Darius took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been through worse situations than this. He had faced combat, dealt with loss, and survived situations that would break most men. But this felt different. This felt personal. "You'll need to wait here until we receive further instructions," one of the officers said, as though he were reading from a script. Darius nodded, but inside, his mind was racing. Something wasn't right. Something deeper was going on, and he wasn't going to rest until he found out what it was. Billy deserved better than this, and he was going to make sure that the system didn't dishonor his fallen comrade. No matter the cost. The cold, sterile office was a stark contrast to the warmth of the bustling terminal just beyond the door. The faint hum of the airport's overhead announcements filtered through the walls, but for Darius, everything felt distant, muffled. His mind was racing, his pulse quickening as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. He had been detained, and for what? There was no logical explanation, no reasonable cause for why he was being held back from boarding. Every document he had was legitimate, every procedure he followed was correct, yet he was standing here, denied the right to carry out the simple mission of bringing his fallen comrade home. He tried to steady his breath, but the frustration gnawed at him. It wasn't just the inconvenience, it wasn't just about the lost time. It was the sheer disrespect he felt, disrespect for Billy, for the fallen soldier whose body he was entrusted with, and for himself as a man. This wasn't just a technical issue. This was something deeper, something rooted in a long history of injustice. Darius could feel it in his bones. Minutes passed as Darius sat in the small room, the two security officers stationed at the door, their eyes watching him with a strange mix of suspicion and authority. Neither of them spoke, and the silence was suffocating. His thoughts turned over in his mind, but nothing made sense. Why was he being treated this way? What reason could they have for denying him boarding? The paperwork was in order. The body was under his care with full military authorization. There was nothing wrong. It was then that the door to the small office opened, and a new figure entered. He was a tall man, dressed in the same dark security uniform as the others, but there was something about him that immediately set him apart. He was white, His face hardened, and his expression was cold and unreadable. As he stepped into the room, Darius could feel a shift in the air, an unspoken tension that crackled like static. This was the man who would explain what was happening, or so Darius hoped. The new officer looked Darius over for a moment before speaking, his voice deep and direct. "I'm Officer Grant, and I've been informed of your situation. I understand you've been delayed," he said, his words clipped as if they were an inconvenience to him. Darius looked him squarely in the eyes, his jaw tight, his frustration mounting. "Yes, I've been delayed, and I want to know why. I've followed every procedure, I've done everything by the book, and yet I'm being told that I can't board with the body of my fallen comrade. This doesn't make any sense. I demand a clear explanation." Officer Grant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at the two officers by the door, then back at Darius. The look in his eyes told Darius everything he needed to know. This man wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to clear up a misunderstanding. He was here to enforce something, to impose some kind of authority that Darius wasn't yet understanding. "I'm afraid," Officer Grant said, his voice flat, "that the body cannot be brought on board regardless of your documentation. You'll have to make other arrangements." Darius froze, his mind struggling to process the words. "What do you mean it can't be brought on board? This is a soldier's body, a hero's remains. Why is this happening? What's the real reason for this?" The officer's face remained impassive, but Darius could see the faintest flicker of impatience in his eyes. "The reason is simple, sir. The body cannot be transported on this flight. That's the end of it." Darius shook his head, disbelief and anger swelling inside him. This wasn't just a mistake, this wasn't just bureaucratic error. He could feel it now, the way they were treating him, the dismissive tone, the refusal to provide a legitimate answer. There was something far deeper going on here, and he knew it. This wasn't just about paperwork. This wasn't just about logistics. This was about race. Darius took a slow, deliberate breath, his mind snapping into focus. He had been trained for moments like this. He had faced adversity before, but never in a situation quite like this. Never had he felt so blatantly disrespected, so utterly powerless. He knew he couldn't let this slide. He had to make sure his voice was heard, that he protected his rights and the dignity of the fallen soldier he was transporting. If this was going to be a fight, he was ready for it. "I'm recording this conversation," Darius said suddenly, his voice calm but firm as he pulled out his phone and began to hit the record button. He held it up, making sure that both Officer Grant and the other officers knew that everything being said was now being documented. Officer Grant's expression shifted, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features, but he didn't make any attempt to stop Darius. Perhaps he thought Darius wouldn't follow through. Perhaps he didn't think it would make a difference. But Darius knew better. If they thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were sorely mistaken. "I'm recording this because I deserve an explanation," Darius continued, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of defiance. "I've been respectful, I've followed the rules, and now I'm being denied the right to carry out my mission. That's not just an inconvenience. It's a violation of my rights and a slap in the face to the soldier I'm carrying." The silence in the room thickened, and Darius could feel the tension rise. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. Officer Grant opened his mouth to speak, but Darius cut him off before he could say anything more. "You don't get to make this decision without a valid reason. You don't get to treat me like I'm some kind of criminal when all I'm doing is fulfilling my duty. And you certainly don't get to treat the remains of a soldier, a man who gave his life for this country, as if they're some kind of inconvenience. So I want you to explain this, and I want you to explain it clearly." The words hung in the air, each one heavy with accusation. Officer Grant stood still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Darius thought he might say something else, maybe try to talk down to him, maybe attempt to use his authority to silence him. But to his credit, the officer didn't. Instead, he stood there as if weighing his options. "Sir, I understand that you're upset," Officer Grant said, his voice stiff, but there was a slight crack in his tone, a hint of uncertainty that Darius latched onto. "But the decision is final. You cannot take the body on this flight." The dismissal in his voice was palpable, but Darius refused to let it intimidate him. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let them erase his humanity, his dignity, or the memory of Billy Walker. "Then I'm going to make sure the world knows about this," Darius said, his eyes cold and unblinking as he kept the phone trained on the officer. "I'm not leaving this airport until I get a proper explanation, and I'll make sure the truth is known. If you want to do this the hard way, then fine. But I'm not going to be intimidated into silence." Officer Grant's lips tightened, and he exchanged a look with the two officers by the door. Darius could see the wheels turning in their minds, the calculation of how far they were willing to push this situation. But for Darius, there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about one man, one fallen soldier. This was about something much bigger, about standing up against the silent, insidious force of racism that still lingered in places it had no right to be. "Fine," Officer Grant finally said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can record all you want, but the decision won't change." Darius didn't flinch. He had already made his decision. The tension in the small office grew even thicker after Officer Grant's dismissive response. Darius stood his ground, his gaze unwavering as he kept the phone steady in his hand. His jaw clenched, muscles taut, his body coiled with a mixture of frustration and determination. He wasn't going to let this go. No matter how many times they told him he couldn't board, no matter how many times they tried to brush him off, he wasn't backing down. For a few moments, there was nothing but the suffocating silence of the room. Officer Grant and the other security personnel stood still, staring at Darius as if trying to gauge his next move. They were clearly uncomfortable, unsure of how to proceed with this increasingly contentious situation. Darius could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their judgment heavy on his shoulders. But it didn't matter. He had a mission to complete. He had a duty to fulfill, and no one, no matter how high up they were, was going to take that away from him. But then, just as he was preparing for the next round of back and forth, the door to the office opened once again. This time, however, it wasn't another security officer. The man who stepped into the room was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his posture upright and commanding. He exuded authority, but there was a calmness in his demeanor that instantly put Darius on alert. This man was clearly different from the security officers who had been dismissive and unhelpful. This man held a different kind of power. The supervisor, his name was Michael Dunn, as his badge indicated, looked around the room, briefly scanning the situation before his eyes locked onto Darius. For a moment, there was a strange look of realization in his eyes, as if he were piecing together the events that had led to this point. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Officer Grant," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room like a knife, "I've been informed about this situation. I need to speak to the passenger privately." Darius stood his ground but relaxed his shoulders slightly. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when someone higher up would come in and hopefully resolve the issue. The security officers didn't argue. They stepped aside, allowing Supervisor Dunn to approach Darius, who remained standing, his phone still recording. "Sir," Dunn began, his tone authoritative but not confrontational, "I'm the airport supervisor. I've just been made aware of the issue you're facing. First and foremost, I want to apologize for what's happened here today. This is unacceptable and I want to get to the bottom of it." Darius' eyes narrowed slightly, and he tilted his head. "What do you mean by unacceptable?" Because I've been waiting for someone to explain to me what's going on. Dunn's face softened, his expression becoming more sympathetic. I understand your frustration, sir. The body you're carrying, it's a soldier's remains, correct? That's right, Darius said firmly. A soldier who died in service. And I'm the one tasked with bringing him home, with making sure his family can bury him properly. But I've been told that I'm not allowed to board with the body, despite having all the proper paperwork. This doesn't make sense, and I'm being treated as if I'm trying to do something illegal, when all I'm doing is honoring a fallen hero. Dunn's gaze shifted slightly, his brow furrowing as if he were processing the information. He glanced back at Officer Grant, who was standing stiffly near the door. There was an unspoken exchange between the two, but Dunn didn't seem to take Grant's side. Instead, his attention returned to Darius. I see, Dunn said, his voice carrying the weight of the situation. I'm going to be honest with you, sir. What you're experiencing is something I cannot condone. This should never have happened. This isn't about paperwork or regulations. This is about how you've been treated. I can clearly see that you've been subjected to unfair treatment. I'm sure that wasn't the intent of our staff, but it's happened nonetheless. Darius didn't relax, but his posture shifted just slightly. He'd been in enough situations where people apologized and offered nothing more than empty words. He wasn't here for an apology. He was here to ensure that he could complete his mission and make sure that the soldier's body was treated with respect. Still, hearing the supervisor acknowledge the injustice was a small victory. What exactly do you mean by unfair treatment? Darius asked, not letting his guard down completely. Dunn met his gaze, unflinching. I've been told by the team here that they couldn't let you bring the body on board, but they haven't given you a reason why, have they? No, Darius replied, his voice tight. They just keep saying it's against the rules, but when I ask for an explanation, they can't provide one. They simply tell me it's not allowed. Dunn sighed, his hand resting on the back of the chair across from Darius. That's not how things are supposed to work here. We have protocols for handling such cases, but I can tell you right now that there is no regulation that would prevent you from bringing a fallen soldier's body on board, especially not when all the necessary paperwork is in place. There is absolutely no reason you should be treated this way. Darius let the words sink in. The relief that washed over him was brief but potent. He had hoped for this moment, an intervention from someone who could see the injustice and correct it. But there was still the matter of the humiliation, the frustration, the wasted time. The damage had been done, and Darius wasn't ready to forget it just yet. I appreciate that, Darius said, his voice still measured but carrying a clear undertone of anger. But this situation isn't just about paperwork or rules. It's about respect. It's about how someone like me is treated when we try to do something right. There's a lot more at play here than you might realize. Dunn nodded solemnly. You're right, he said. I can't speak for what has happened before, but I can speak for what's happening now. This ends here. You will be allowed to board with the body, and I will ensure that the necessary accommodations are made to make sure that you and your fellow passengers are treated with the dignity and respect you deserve. Darius allowed himself a brief nod, though his stance remained resolute. Good, but I won't forget this. You can resolve the situation today, but this kind of thing can't keep happening. People like me deserve better. I understand, Dunn replied sincerely. I will personally make sure that this doesn't happen again. I'll make sure that our staff is re-educated about how to handle these situations in the future. Darius didn't respond immediately. His emotions were still raw, still swirling from the tension that had built up over the past few hours. But hearing Dunn take accountability, hearing him commit to real change made a difference. It wasn't the same as erasing the injustice, but it was something. With a final glance at Officer Grant and the rest of the security team, Dunn turned back to Darius. You can go now. The body will be allowed on board and we'll make sure everything goes smoothly from here. Darius gave a slight nod, though his mind was already elsewhere. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this was a small victory, a reminder that standing up for what was right could make a difference, even when the odds were stacked against you. He turned and walked out of the office, his head held high. The mission wasn't over yet, but at least now he could move forward with a sense of purpose. The fallen soldier would be brought home, as it should be, and Darius had made sure that no one would forget how he was treated along the way. Darius walked briskly through the terminal, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. After the confrontation in the back office, the supervisor's intervention had cleared the way for him to board the plane, but the event still lingered in his mind, gnawing at him like a persistent ache. The official apology from Supervisor Dunn had been a small victory, and he appreciated it, but it didn't erase the sting of the discrimination he'd faced, nor the bitter taste of injustice that lingered after being treated as though he didn't belong. He pushed through the gate with a sense of purpose, walking with his head held high, though his chest was tight with emotion. The suitcase in his hand felt heavier than it should, and the body of the fallen soldier, the mission he was carrying out, seemed to weigh even more. It wasn't just the body of a man who had sacrificed his life for his country, but also a symbol of the hardships that many black men and women faced every day. As much as he wanted to get on the plane and move past this, Darius couldn't help but feel the gravity of the situation weighing on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He made his way to the boarding area, where a line of passengers waited. The stares from the other passengers were subtle, but he felt them just the same. People's glances flicked to him and away, as if they were uncertain whether to acknowledge his presence or pretend it wasn't there. Darius knew he was in for a long flight, one that would likely leave him with more questions than answers. As he approached the gate agent, a young woman who had been part of the initial process, she gave him a polite, if somewhat awkward, smile. Darius returned the gesture, his lips curling into a faint, tight smile. He didn't hold anything against her. She was just following protocol, doing her job. But it was hard to forget that the system, the institution itself, had been the one that had caused this entire situation to unfold. "You're all set, Mr. King," the gate agent said, her voice almost too cheery. "Your seat is ready and everything is cleared." Darius nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." As he made his way onto the plane, he couldn't help but think back on what had transpired just a few hours earlier. The way he had been treated wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger picture, one that black men and women in this country had lived with for generations. Discrimination, whether blatant or subtle, was still a daily reality. And it wasn't just about the flight or the paperwork. It was about something deeper, something systemic. As he settled into his seat, he thought about the soldier whose body he was transporting. A man who had given his life for his country, only to be forgotten by the system that had sent him to war in the first place. The soldier's sacrifice was something to be honored, to be remembered, but it also symbolized the countless others who had been marginalized, overlooked, and undervalued because of their race, their background, or the color of their skin. The flight took off smoothly, and as the plane climbed into the sky, Darius gazed out the window at the sprawling city below. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. But even as the colors shifted, the sense of unease within him remained. He thought about the people who had made his journey difficult, the ones who had tried to stand in his way, to prevent him from completing his mission. It wasn't just the airline staff or the security personnel. It was the system itself, the same system that had perpetuated racial inequality for so long. And though he had won this small battle, Darius knew there were countless others who wouldn't get the same opportunity, who wouldn't have a supervisor come to their aid or a moment of intervention that could change the course of their day. His phone buzzed, and Darius glanced down at it. A text from his sister, Tiffany. She had been the one to organize the funeral back home, ensuring that everything would go smoothly for their fallen brother in arms. Her message was short but full of the warmth and love that Darius always appreciated. "We'll be waiting for you. The family will be together and we'll honor him the way he deserves. Safe travels, bro." Darius smiled to himself, his eyes lingering on the screen. He replied with a simple, heartfelt message. "Thanks, sis. I'll be there soon." The warmth of her words helped to ease some of the tension that had been building inside him, but the thought of the larger issue, the problem that still lay beneath the surface, remained. The discrimination that had taken place at the airport wasn't just an isolated experience. It was a reflection of the larger societal issues that still plagued the country. Darius wasn't naive. He knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight, but he also knew that every small action counted. Standing up for what was right, even when it felt uncomfortable or even dangerous, was how progress was made. And while he might not have been able to change the system in a single day, he had done something important. He had spoken up. He had refused to be silenced or treated unfairly. And that, in itself, was a form of resistance, a form of defiance against the injustice that ran deep. As the plane sailed higher into the sky, Darius found himself thinking about the future. He thought about the young soldiers who were coming home in the same way, the ones who would have their own stories to tell, their own experiences to share. He thought about how much still needed to be done to make sure that their sacrifices were honored, not just in words, but in action. But for now, he let out a deep breath, his body settling into the seat. There was still work to be done. But this mission, this important mission to bring a fallen soldier home, was a step in the right direction. And that was enough for today. As the plane continued its flight, Darius closed his eyes and leaned back, thinking of home and of the soldiers who had come before him. He would honor them all, and he would never forget the lessons that had been learned along the way. This was his battle, his fight for justice, and he would keep fighting for what was right, no matter the cost.